It was a crisp evening in Portland, the kind of rain that never seemed to end. Soft, steady, persistent. The streets shimmered with the reflections of streetlights. As the city, known for its creative pulse, thrived in a quiet tension. But on the horizon, something dark was unfolding. March 2023 was not like any other. A storm was coming, but not the kind the weather forecast could predict. It was something far worse. A series of disappearances that would change the city forever. 5 young women would vanish unseen, unheard, and their bodies would be discovered in the most unlikely places, hidden in the shadows of the city's most forgotten corners. Portland, a city marked by its progressive spirit, also had a side often overlooked. Addiction, poverty, and displacement weaved their way through the streets, leaving people to fade into the background. These women, trapped in a cycle of survival and vulnerability, had become invisible to society, and yet no one could have prepared for the horrifying discovery that would shatter the illusion of safety in this progressive city. It began quietly enough, just one disappearance, then another. A tragedy, a momentary sting. At first, there were no connections, no suspects, and no answers. Just grief, just empty words shared by broken families hoping someone would listen. Yet, beneath this surface of silence, something sinister was quietly unfolding. Over the course of 3 months, 5 women disappeared, and the city would begin to question whether it had a killer in its midst. Kristen Smith, 22, was the first to vanish. She was everything the city should have been proud of, full of dreams, passionate, vibrant, but caught in the grip of addiction. Her life had been complicated, like so many others who faced the cold indifference of Portland's darkest corners. She was reported missing on December 22, 2022. Her family clung to the hope that she would return, that somehow, despite the odds, she would come home. Flyers circulated, her photo was everywhere, yet the days stretched on, and hope began to fade. And then, on February 19, 2023, everything changed. A group of hikers discovered the body in a wooded area off Southeast Deer Orf Road, an isolated part of Portland's Pleasant Valley neighborhood. The body was decomposed, and the terrain was treacherous. No one expected the discovery to be hers. It was a cruel twist. Kristen had been dead for months. But it was not just the finding of her body that would change everything. It was the realization that her death was not an isolated tragedy. More women began to disappear. Joanna Speaks, 32, a mother of 3, was last seen near Clackamas Town Center. She left behind children who would never see their mother again. Lynn Perry, 24, had tried so hard to rebuild her life, battling addiction with fierce determination. Bridget Leanne Webster, 31, was last seen somewhere in the Portland metro area. All of them vulnerable, all of them women who had slipped through the cracks of society. And then there was Ashley Reel. Just 22, Ashley had recently filed a domestic violence complaint, a cry for help that went unanswered. Like the others, she too disappeared. These 5 women, each with different stories, different struggles, shared one tragic fate. They were young. They were vulnerable. They lived on the margins, often invisible to the very society that should have protected them. They were overlooked until, of course, it was too late. By the time spring arrived, the city of Portland had already been shaken to its core. And while the police, at first, refused to connect the dots, families began to question what was happening. How could so many women, so young, disappear without anyone noticing? How could their bodies be found in such remote, desolate places? Were these deaths truly unrelated? Or was there something more sinister at play? The quiet whispers among the families grew into loud calls for justice. They would not let their daughters, their sisters, fade into obscurity. They would not be ignored. And slowly the police would begin to hear what the families had already known. That there was a killer in Portland, and they had been hiding in plain sight all along. Kristen Smith was a young woman with a bright future that seemed to be slipping through her fingers. At 22, she had the world ahead of her, dreams bigger than her circumstances. Aspirations that could have lifted her far beyond the struggles that clung to her like a shadow. But Portland, for all its progressive ideals, was a city where some were left behind. Kristen was one of those people, caught in the unrelenting grip of addiction, struggling to escape the cycle that so many others in the city fell into. She was no different than countless others lost in a world that too often seemed indifferent to their pain. It was December 22nd, 2022, when Kristen was reported missing. Her family, devastated but hopeful, did everything they could to find her. Flyers were posted on telephone poles. Her photos circulated online, and friends and strangers alike shared her story, hoping to bring her back. But days turned into weeks, and as winter gave way to spring, that hope began to fade. Kristen's family held on to the belief that she would be found, that she was still out there, somewhere. Her mother, frantic with worry, spoke to anyone who would listen, hoping for a lead, a clue, anything that could point them in the right direction. But the days dragged on in silence. The city, meanwhile, continued to spin its usual web of activity businesses, opened and closed. The homeless wandered the streets. The rain fell in a never-ending rhythm, but behind closed doors, Kristen's family suffered. Then, on February 19th, 2023, everything changed. Hikers, looking to enjoy a peaceful walk in Portland's Pleasant Valley neighborhood, stumbled upon a grim discovery. At first, they thought it might have been a small animal, some kind of wildlife caught in the underbrush. But as they ventured deeper, they found something more sinister. Human remains, decomposed, beyond recognition. The area was secluded, hidden from the prying eyes of the city. It was the kind of place where no one ventured. A forgotten corner of Portland, where the shadows stretched long, and where the city's struggles were often buried. And in that quiet, isolated spot, Kristen Smith was found. The medical examiner later confirmed what everyone feared. She had been dead for months. But the haunting question remained, how had she ended up in such a place? And more importantly, why? Kristen's death was a turning point, though no one knew it at the time. It was treated as just another tragedy, another name added to the growing list of the city's lost souls. But for those who knew her, for those who understood the struggle she faced, it was the beginning of something darker. The death of Kristen Smith was no longer just another victim lost to addiction or poverty. It was the beginning of a series of disappearances that would shake the city to its core. And yet, it was only the first. As winter turned to spring, the story of Kristen Smith would intertwine with the stories of other women, women whose lives had been broken in different ways, but who shared the same fate. The same tragic fate that no one seemed to notice. And soon, the question would arise, was this the work of a serial killer? Or just the unfortunate consequence of a city, failing to see the people it had cast aside? Kristen's story was only the beginning, and as the months unfolded, the city would realize that this was not just a case of addiction and tragedy, it was the result of something far more deliberate, something far more dangerous. And it was happening right under their noses. The disappearances were not isolated. They continued, each one leaving a trail of heartbreak and unanswered questions. It was not long before the pattern became undeniable. The city's streets, often teeming with life, suddenly felt empty, like something had been removed, leaving a void that no one could fill. The first signs of a serial killer began to emerge in the collective consciousness of those who had lost someone or feared losing someone. Joanna Speaks, 32, a mother of 3, was the next to vanish. She had been a woman with a quiet strength, a mother trying to make a life for her children in a world that had not been kind to her. Her disappearance on March 4th, 2023, sent shockwaves through the community. She had been last seen near Clackamas Town Center, a place where many women passed through, but few stayed long. Joanna's children would never see their mother again. They would grow up without the warmth of her embrace, without the love that only a mother can give. Charity Lynn Perry, 24, had been trying to rebuild her life after years of struggle. She was described by those who knew her as fierce, resilient, and determined. Addiction had controlled much of her life, but she was working hard to break free from it. Charity was a survivor until she disappeared in early March, leaving behind a life still in progress, a future that would never come to be. Friends and family held out hope for her, but deep down, they feared the worst. Bridget Leanne Webster, 31, was another name added to the growing list. Bridget had lived a life on the margins, vulnerable, overlooked. She had become another face in the crowd, someone the world had forgotten. She was last seen somewhere in the Portland metro area, and like the others, she disappeared without explanation. Her absence was felt, But for a city like Portland, it was not enough to raise alarms. At least, not yet. And then there was Ashley Reel. At just 22 years old, Ashley had recently filed a domestic violence complaint, a desperate cry for help that went unanswered. She had been brave, speaking out against the abuse she had endured, but the system had failed her. Like the others, Ashley vanished in late March, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. What happened to her? Was she just another victim of an indifferent system, or was something more sinister at play? Each of these women had a different story. Some had children, some were trying to break free from addiction, and others were just trying to survive in a city that did not always make space for them. But what they all had in common was that they were young, vulnerable, and invisible in the eyes of society. They were women who had been overlooked by a system that failed to protect them. And in a city full of progress, they had become statistics. Just another tragic reminder of a world that could not keep them safe. As each body was discovered, the fear began to grow. The first discovery was Kristen Smith, found in the remote woods in February 2023. The second came with the discovery of Joanna Speaks' body, found in an abandoned barn in Ridgefield, Washington, just 20 miles from Portland. The location was eerie, a decaying structure, left to rot. Just as Joanna had been, her death was ruled a homicide, but questions lingered. Who could have done this? Why here? And most importantly, who was next? On April 24, 2023, searchers made another grim discovery. Charity Lynn Perry's body was found in a culvert beneath Interstate 84, hidden out of sight. The area was isolated, requiring someone with knowledge of the terrain to know where to look. That same day, in Portland's Lent neighborhood, a body was discovered inside a tent at a homeless encampment. Though foul play was not immediately suspected, the timing raised new questions. Was this connected? Was there a link between the bodies? April 30th, 2023 brought yet another discovery. Bridget Leanne Webster's body was found in a rural part of Polk County, south of Sheridan. Like the others, she had been left in an isolated location, far from where she had last been seen. The final discovery came on May 7th, 2023, when a fisherman stumbled upon human remains in a wooded area near Eagle Creek in Clackamas County. The body was later identified as Ashley Reel, the youngest victim, whose tragic story had been one of the most haunting. These women, each discarded in desolate locations. Barns, forests, culverts, and ravines had been left behind, as though they were nothing more than forgotten debris. These were not random locations, these were places someone knew well. They were chosen carefully, methodically. Whoever was responsible for these crimes had a deep understanding of the landscape, the back roads, and the places where people would rarely venture. But despite the mounting similarities, Portland's police were slow to act. For months, they continued to insist that the deaths were unrelated. They refused to connect the dots, citing a lack of evidence and suspects. They said it was simply the tragic outcomes of women living on the fringes of society deaths that happened all too often in a city that had become used to heartache. But the families refused to accept this explanation. They saw the pattern, they saw the connections. And they knew the truth that their daughters were not just statistics, but victims of something much darker. And so, the search continued. The families did not stop. They refused to be silenced, to be ignored. They began to take matters into their own hands, organizing searches in places the police had overlooked. They mapped the locations where their daughters had been found, piecing together a story that was all too clear. There was a killer in Portland, and the city had been blind to the warning signs. The search for answers had intensified. The police were beginning to connect the dots, but the families had already been ahead of them. They had gathered evidence, piecing together a chilling narrative, long before law enforcement made the connection. But there was one piece of the puzzle that no one had yet discovered, the name that would come to haunt Portland for years to come: Jesse Lee Calhoun. Calhoun was no stranger to the criminal justice system. His past was as violent and troubled as it was long. A career criminal with a history of theft, burglary, and assault, he was not someone who had ever been given the benefit of the doubt. His criminal record spanned decades, beginning in 2004 with charges ranging from assaulting a police officer to injuring a police dog during an arrest. He had been labeled a prolific thief and a career criminal by law enforcement. In 2018, during another arrest, Calhoun was found in possession of methamphetamine, multiple firearms, and over 500 rounds of ammunition, signs that he had no intention of ever playing by the rules. Yet, despite his violent past, Calhoun was given a chance, one that would prove to be deadly. In 2020, amid the wildfires that ravaged Oregon, the state was desperate for help. They turned to every available resource, including inmates from the Oregon Department of Corrections, to assist with firefighting efforts. Calhoun, serving a 50-month sentence at the time, was one of those inmates. He was assigned to fight the fires, a job that was grueling, dangerous, and, for many, a chance at early release. For Calhoun, this opportunity would change everything. On March 5, 2021, Governor Kate Brown issued conditional commutations for 41 inmates who had served on fire crews, including Calhoun. His sentence was shortened by nearly a year. And just a few months later, on July 22, 2021, he walked free. The commutations were part of a broader push for criminal justice reform in Oregon, an effort to clear the state's death row and pardon thousands of cannabis-related convictions. While these actions were often praised for their humanitarian approach, they had unintended consequences. In Calhoun's case, they gave a killer a second chance. When Calhoun was released, he was placed under post-prison supervision, a system designed to monitor his behavior and prevent further criminal activity. He was required to obey all laws, avoid arrests, and check in regularly with authorities. But for all the oversight, it was clear that something was wrong. The warning signs were there loud and clear, but they were ignored. In May 2022, just 10 months after his release, a man named Craig Wangrad filed a stalking complaint against Calhoun. The complaint detailed disturbing threats Calhoun had made, including one message where he allegedly wrote, "I know everything about you, dude. Everywhere you go, what you do." Another read, "You are an expletive idiot that can't get over Krista." I am here to say that won't be happening much longer. The threats were direct and menacing. Yet, the judge dismissed the petition the very next day, and Calhoun remained free to continue his violent behavior. Then, in November 2022, a far more urgent complaint was filed, this time by Ashley Reel, one of the women who would later become one of Calhoun's victims. Ashley, only 22 years old, had accused Calhoun of assaulting and choking her. But despite her brave attempt to seek justice, no arrest was made. Both incidents, the stalking and the assault, were clear violations of Calhoun's post-prison supervision terms. But the system failed to act, missing crucial opportunities to intervene. The agency responsible for monitoring Calhoun, the Multnomah County Department of Community Justice, eventually acknowledged that Calhoun had violated his release conditions. However, the agency refused to release any details, citing an active investigation, but by the time they finally started connecting the dots, it was already too late. The women who had vanished, the bodies that had been found, and the families who had fought for answers. They all had one thing in common: Jesse Lee Calhoun. As the months passed and more bodies were discovered, it became clear that Calhoun's knowledge of Portland's landscape, its back roads, its forgotten corners, was no accident. He knew exactly where to take his victims. He understood the places where they could be left to rot, hidden away from the world. The location of each body, each abandoned place, was not a coincidence. These were places Calhoun knew well. He had been hiding in plain sight, operating in the shadows, unnoticed by the very system that was supposed to protect people like the women he had killed. It was not just that Calhoun had been given a chance to fight fires and rebuild his life. It was that the system had failed to protect the very people it was designed to serve. The people who had already been forgotten, those living on the margins of society, were now being picked off one by one. And Jesse Lee Calhoun had become the monster that no one had seen coming. But as the investigation continued, the question remained: how many more women would suffer before someone finally connected the dots? And why had so many red flags been ignored? As the bodies of the victims continued to surface, the city of Portland remained gripped by a sense of dread, a haunting feeling that something was terribly wrong. But while law enforcement hesitated, the families of the missing women refused to let their daughters be forgotten. The mothers, who had been ignored and dismissed by authorities, began to fight back with everything they had. They refused to be silenced. They refused to allow their daughters to be treated as just another tragic statistic. Melissa Smith, the mother of Kristen Smith, was one of the first to speak out. Her grief, raw and all-encompassing, drove her to take action. She had watched her daughter slip away into the shadows of addiction, but now she was determined to ensure that Kristen's death would not be swept under the rug. She was joined by Diana Allen, the mother of Charity Lynn Perry, and the other families who had lost their daughters. Together, they formed what they called the Fighting Families. Bound by their shared loss and fueled by their refusal to be ignored, they took matters into their own hands. The police, for their part, still insisted that the deaths were unrelated. They pointed to the lack of clear suspects and insisted that the disappearances could be explained away as tragedies, isolated, unfortunate incidents. But the families were not convinced. They knew the truth before the authorities did. They knew that these women had not just vanished into thin air, they had been taken. And they had been left behind in places no one ever bothered to look. The families started meeting in person, comparing notes, pushing for answers. They organized online groups, mapping locations, sharing information, and refusing to be ignored. They contacted anyone they could think of, journalists, investigators, even local politicians, desperate for someone to listen. Slowly but surely, the pattern that had been forming over the past few months began to emerge more clearly. The women had all disappeared from the same area as Southeast 82nd Avenue, Clackamas Town Center. Their bodies had been dumped in rural or isolated locations, far from where they had been last seen. The killings were not random, they were organized, intentional, local. The families were not the only ones who started to notice the pattern. By June 2023, law enforcement had begun to connect the dots. The Portland Police Bureau, along with the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office and other regional partners, quietly formed a multi-agency task force to investigate the murders. And at the center of it all was one name, Jesse Lee Calhoun. Forensics, including DNA evidence, linked Calhoun to at least one of the victims. Witness statements placed him with the others. His movements, his knowledge of the terrain, his violent history, it all aligned. It became impossible to ignore. The more investigators dug, the more they realized that the women who had been killed were not random victims. They were all part of a plan. One meticulously crafted by a man who had lived in the shadows of Portland for far too long. But the breakthrough came on June 6, 2023, when law enforcement moved in to arrest Calhoun. They approached him in Milwaukee, where he had been staying, to arrest him on a parole violation. Calhoun, however, was not going to go down without a fight. In a desperate attempt to escape, he bolted. He dove into the Willamette River, trying to outrun the authorities, but it was too late. He was caught, pulled from the river, and arrested. That same day, prosecutors reached out to Governor Tina Kotek's office and requested an emergency revocation of Calhoun's commutation. The governor responded quickly, voiding the commutation and sending Calhoun back to prison to serve the rest of his original sentence. Calhoun, who had once been given a second chance to rebuild his life, was now being held in connection with something far darker. A serial killer had been hiding in plain sight, and the full scope of his crimes was just beginning to unfold. For the families, the arrest was a bittersweet victory. They had fought for over a year to have their daughters taken seriously, to prove that there was a pattern, that these women had not simply vanished by chance. They had stood in the face of doubt and disbelief, pushing forward despite the setbacks, despite the fear that their daughters might be forgotten, and now, at last, they had the truth. The man who had taken their daughters, who had left them discarded in remote corners of the city, was finally going to be held accountable. But even as the families felt the weight of this small victory, there was still so much left to be done. The investigation into Calhoun's crimes was far from over, and there were still many unanswered questions. How many other women had he targeted? Were there more victims yet to be discovered? What other failures had allowed him to roam free for so long? And perhaps, most painfully of all, could any of this have been prevented? If the red flags had been taken seriously, if law enforcement had acted sooner, could these women still be alive today? These questions would haunt the families for months and even years to come. Jesse Lee Calhoun's arrest was just the beginning. It marked a turning point in the case, but the road to justice would not be easy. Calhoun, now in custody, was facing multiple charges in connection with the deaths of at least 3 women: Charity Lynn Perry, Joanna Speaks, and Bridget Leanne Webster. But for the families, the weight of the situation was far from over. The legal process, though necessary, felt like an eternity. It was a cruel reminder of how much time had been lost, time that could never be regained. While Calhoun sat in prison, awaiting trial, detectives worked tirelessly behind the scenes, gathering witness statements, forensic evidence, and piecing together the timeline of his crimes. The families, meanwhile, waited, growing more frustrated with each passing month. Every day without answers felt like an eternity. Every day the weight of their loss grew heavier. But they had come too far to stop now. They had fought for this moment, and they would not let it slip away. In May 2024, nearly a year after Calhoun's arrest, the case reached a pivotal moment. A Multnomah County grand jury indicted him on multiple charges, including 3 counts of second-degree murder for the deaths of Perry, Speaks, and Webster. The indictment also included 3 counts of abuse of a corpse, marking a chilling and deliberate disregard for the lives he had taken. The indictment outlined a haunting timeline of events. Perry was killed on March 8, 2023, her body discovered 7 weeks later. Speaks was murdered just 10 days later, her remains found in an abandoned barn. Webster was killed on April 26th, her body recovered only 4 days later in a remote part of Polk County. 3 women, 3 murders, in just 6 weeks. Each victim dumped in an isolated location far from where they had been last seen. Each killing more calculated than the last. Each one closer to the others, as though Calhoun's grip on the city had tightened. But there were notable absences in the indictment. Kristen Smith and Ashley Reel, 2 of the earliest victims, were not included in the charges, at least, not yet. Prosecutors stated that their investigations were still ongoing, leaving open the possibility of additional charges in the future. For the families, this was a bitter pill to swallow. They had fought so hard to get this far, but the justice they sought for their daughters was still incomplete. They knew the truth, and they would not rest until every victim was accounted for. During a press conference announcing the indictment, Multnomah County District Attorney Mike Schmidt addressed the victims' families directly. He said, "This community holds you in our hearts and is here to support you. We are committed to seeking justice in these tragic murders." But for the families, words were never enough. They had already lived through the pain of losing their daughters, and now they had to watch as the justice they had fought for slowly unfolded before their eyes. The indictment of Jesse Lee Calhoun was an important step forward, but it raised difficult questions. How had a man with such a violent criminal history been granted early release? Why had the warnings, both from the victims and the public, been ignored for so long? How had Calhoun been allowed to roam free while the lives of these women were torn apart? For some, the case had become a flashpoint in the ongoing debate about Oregon's criminal justice system. Critics pointed to Governor Kate Brown's clemency program, arguing that it had been too broad, that the release of Calhoun had been a fatal mistake. But supporters of the program countered that Calhoun would have been released anyway, whether through commutation or the completion of his sentence. The real failure, they argued, was not the clemency itself, but the system's inability to monitor and intervene when it was clear that Calhoun posed a danger to society. For the families, the politics of criminal justice meant little. What mattered to them was that their daughters had been forgotten. Their deaths had been ignored. Their stories had been erased. And it was only through their tireless advocacy, their refusal to give up, that answers had begun to surface. They had turned their grief into action. Refusing to let their daughters fade into obscurity, they would make sure their names lived on. They would ensure that the world remembered who they were. Women with lives, with families, with futures that had been stolen far too soon. As Calhoun sat behind bars, awaiting trial, the city of Portland was left to grapple with its own failures. A city that had once prided itself on progress and inclusivity now had to face the reality of how easily people on the margins had been overlooked. These were not just the deaths of women living in poverty or addiction. These were the deaths of women who deserved to be seen, who deserved to be protected, but who had been discarded by a system that had failed them. The rain still fell on Portland streets, washing over the sidewalks, the back alleys, and the neighborhoods touched by tragedy. But it did not wash away the memories. It did not erase the pain. It did not undo the past. Some secrets in the Pacific Northwest remained buried, but not these. These women had been found. Their stories were told, and the families who refused to stop searching would make sure that their names were never forgotten. The reign of the Portland killer had lasted only 3 months, but its impact would echo far longer. In the end, It was not the system that brought justice. It was the mothers who refused to stop searching. It was the families who turned their heartbreak into action, who gave their daughters the voice they had been denied. And as the investigation continued, the city and the world would be forced to reckon with the lives that had been lost, and the ones who refused to let their deaths be in vain.